We're in for a pretty informative and interesting and in some ways scary presentation. Some of us have seen some of these slides before, but some of them will be a little bit different. As we try to get into this, one of the things we thought we would do is sort of think through what it means to followers of Jesus to be stewards of God's creation. And I think we often forget that we are only stewards. We are not owners. And so stewards look after things for someone else. We're stewards of all of God's creation, whether it's the people that are part of that, whether it's the land, whether it's our environment, whether it's the resources or assets that are part of this earth. Those are the things that God has asked us to look after. Both Grace and I get a daily devotion from Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest. And I've really enjoyed his meditations. And just this past week, he talks about wisdom and was saying that wisdom comes from having our mind, our heart, and our body all working in harmony. He also says in North America, we have relied mainly on our mind, the intellect, and we have gone to great lengths to try to train our intellect to understand everything and to try and rationalize everything that we see. We need to learn, I think, from our Aboriginal friends who understood God's creation to be spiritual, to be something well beyond what the mind can fathom. And so they often talk things like Mother God and things like that. And they revered the animals and the nature around them, and they tried to be careful with God's creation. It seems to me that we have more or less tried to exploit what we have, and we've been a part of that for many, many years. And we know that if in the creation story God created this perfect Garden of Eden, and then because of our sin, it became something different than that, less than perfect. It's interesting, as I was looking at some of this stuff, the scripture in Genesis, I think 23, that talks about letting the land lie fallow in the seventh year. So till it for 6 and let it lie fallow. And for the most part, that's probably the part of the verse I've focused on. But I read the other part of the verse. It's in just the next sentence after it. And it says, let it lie fallow so the poor in the land can reap what grows. And we all know that when we harvest grain or we harvest something, the seeds that fall come up the next year sometimes. And so it says, let it lie fallow so that the poor can have something to eat, and what they don't take, the animals can have. And so I thought, this is all about this caring for everyone. I think the idea of the garden was that we all would be on a similar footing. Because if you read the next verse, or you go into Nehemiah, I think it's not Genesis, it's Nehemiah. It also says every 7 years all debt is canceled. So the beginning of this world that we know or that we come to believe, this biblical world, is basically, I think, trying to set us all on an even platform. But we now live in a world where there's billionaires and people dying of starvation. Is very, very wide. The spectrum is very wide. So what do? Because if you're like me, I'm buying into this billionaire lifestyle, you know? I've got the good in the land. I'm not dying of starvation. I can go on trips. I can do all kinds of things. And so we've bought into this, and we are the privileged. We consume, we waste, and we pollute. So if we think of this earth, or at least the earth that the Bible talks about, is 6,000 or plus or minus a few years old. And when I think of what has happened in the 100 years I've been on earth, well, not quite 100 years, but it feels like it some days, and it's getting closer to that. The world seems to have changed. Now, didn't live in the 1800s, so I don't know what it was like around that. But in the 1900s, we've seems to me that we've raped the land more than we've cared for it. We can justify not leaving the land fallow for a year because we have fertilizers that we can throw on it and we can still grow and get wonderful crops. But now we're in a pickle. We got some issues. Nature seems to be rebelling, and many of us are not listening. In our little corner of the globe, Wellesley Township, we are trying to look at it and do something about it. The township has declared a climate emergency, and you see that in the info every time you read it. We have about 12,000, not quite, just coming to 12,000 people in Wellesley Township. There's just under 8 billion people in the world. So we are, in a percentage of it, we are 0.00015% of the world's population, which probably is a part of a drop in the ocean. It's not very much. And so what do we do? Where do we go with this? And because we have to do something and we have to pay attention. And we're going to ask Michael now to talk a little bit about some of the findings that he has and some of the science around this and some of the information he has. So we'll give it over to Michael, and then we'll open it up at the end. Hopefully we'll have a number of questions.
Well, thank you, Bob. I'm not quite as old as Bob. If he's 100, then I don't think there's anybody here who is as old as Bob. Okay. Now, while we're looking at this, these are actually some cards that I have been talking, and we have been talking to the seniors, and there are a number of you here who have seen the presentations as we've been dealing with this issue. And Bob and Grace prepared some cards, so I'm just going to hand these out at the back, and as the presentation goes along, you can just pass them down the row if you would, and pass them forward, and you can read all these little nuggets of quotes by various important people about climate change. So I'll just hand these out at the back, and if you'd like to pass them down, please do so. So some of you will have already seen these slides. I've had to tailor the presentation differently for various situations, but we have to look at this situation in from various ways. Bob has presented one way of thinking about climate change and our care for it, but it is also a scientific subject. We're dealing with the atmosphere, we're dealing with the oceans. These work according to the rules of physics. And so there are all kinds of measurements that have been made, and we can show scientifically from graphs and what have you that climate warming is occurring. And also we can come to a conclusion that human activity is causing the conversion of this stored carbon. This is fossil fuels and so on. This is the oil and so on that's in the ground. Our activities, industrial activities, are converting that to carbon dioxide, a gas which is causing greenhouse warming. And we also have been able to observe that there are events, the retreating glaciers, melting ice sheets, melting permafrost, sea level rise, ocean warming, and all kinds of extreme weather events that are all consistent with what we see as climate warming. And unfortunately, as the Earth warms, we'll come to a certain point, a tipping point, a certain increase in temperature where the warming will not be reversible. We have a window of opportunity to prevent the Earth from getting to that point, but once this tipping point is reached, all the feedback mechanisms, the gases that are produced by the melting permafrost, the carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere, the methane gases and so on that are being released by vegetation which is appearing from frozen tundras, that will all be feeding back into what we have started, and it will be irreversible until the climate then reaches some new equilibrium in the future. That's the way ice ages have occurred in the past. The Earth's climate has cooled. This is a natural phenomenon. We dealt with this, so I don't have time to deal with that now, but the Earth has gone through these situations in the past where the temperatures have risen and fallen, and the Earth has had to reach new equilibrium, the atmosphere has had to reach new equilibrium points of balance. So that's the situation we find ourselves in, and it is a very serious situation. In fact, it's extremely urgent, and immediate action is required to reduce our carbon footprint. That is the amount of CO2 gas that we're producing through our human industrial activities. And this is a graph showing various agencies around the world who have been measuring temperatures for since the 19th century, showing just how the temperature has been changing. And you can fairly clearly see there that after about 1970 or so, up go the temperatures. And so we have NASA, the Japanese Meteorological Agency, NOAA, the Met Office from in the UK, and various others, including the Canadian Climate Centre, who have observed this. Now here, the warming, that was the warming of the Earth overall. This is warming that is occurring regionally, and how the warming is distributed around the world. We're up to 1970, look what happens. You see all that red? That red is warming. And on the side over here, there's a little bar which shows we have reached, in some parts of Canada already, as much as 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, which is not where we want to be. Now, if we look around the world, this is not a graph of the CO2 emissions by largest amounts contributed by countries. This is the per capita amount of CO2 that is released, the amount that we are sort of individually responsible for, so to speak. So China is actually the producer of the most CO2 gas in the world, but they have a huge population. So when you average that out, the amount per person is less than a country like Canada, where we have a small population. So we're responsible for more individually, so to speak, of CO2 gas than, say, a country like China. But China and the US are the two greatest emitters of carbon dioxide gas. Now here is what will happen, the projection. And people say to me, oh, you weather guys, because I'm a weather guy, if you didn't know that. That's my profession, I'm a meteorologist. They say, oh, you weather guys, you can't even forecast the weather 2 days ahead. How can you know what's going to happen out in the future? Well, I haven't got the time to explain that to you. I know. But we can see that we have warmed, right? So if countries don't act right now, then by the year 2100, we will expect that the Earth will have warmed 4.5 degrees. We're looking for a 1.5 degree close. That's where we figure a tipping point is going to be for the Earth overall. So if countries don't act, we're going to be far beyond that. If we even just follow what we say we're going to do, current policies that is, we're still going to double that value. And even if we carry through with what people have pledged to do around the world, we're talking worldwide now, not just Canada, right? But if we're looking at that situation, we're still going to exceed the 1.5 degree threshold. But what we want to try and focus on today are some solutions, because all is not lost. We still have a window of opportunity. So what will reduce or halt climate warming? Any answers?
Trees.
Trees, yes, maybe, because they do capture carbon. Answer simple. Reduce or stop producing greenhouse gases. That's the very simple answer. Anybody could have come up with that, right? However, the tough part here is how. How do we do that? How do we get people to work on this situation in a cooperative fashion? The world's in a mess. All kinds of problems going on. So there are things that governments, so we can look at this from various ways. We can look at this from on a large scale, how governments could act, or science could maybe help us, down to smaller scales, right down to what individuals can do. And that's how I'm hoping to have structured this. So if you saw the paper just this past week, the Record, our own Record, has had this as one of their headlines for one of the editorials. The climate change war can be won. And I was interested to see that they use the word war, because this is a war. It's a war against, we're against the clock here, and we're fighting a serious battle to prevent the atmosphere from warming. And that requires an awful lot of resources. It requires coordination, it requires cooperation, it requires all of the things that you would have to do during a wartime to organize yourself in order to succeed in what you're doing. So it is a kind of a war. Anyway, they go on to say the situation facing our species is serious but far from hopeless. And they point out in the article that by 2030, Canada will produce 90% of its non-industrial energy from emissions-free sources. This is non-industrial energy. This is what we use at home every day. And so our energy sources will be coming from hydro, nuclear, solar, and wind. These are called renewables. And the estimate is that carbon releases from power utilities by 2030 will have declined 80% because we're switching over from the way we generate energy. And the good news is that we're not alone in making changes on a national basis. Clean energy transitions are underway in other countries around the world. The US, in spite of leadership there, in spite of that, their energy-related emissions have actually declined in 2019 compared to 2018 by nearly 3%. And there have been other significant declines in the European Union, the UK, and Japan. Now, I know that some people do not like to see taxes, and they call the CO2 tax a tax. But pollution has a cost. It impacts the air we breathe, our children's health, it impacts the economy, and that's why the government of Canada has put a price on carbon pollution. And so a price has to be paid for producing carbon dioxide. And the tax works to shift the burden for the damage from greenhouse gas emissions back to those who are responsible for it. And it gives a signal to them, either decrease your emissions and pay less, or continue or make more emissions and pay more. And so the revenues that are raised that way can come back either into the taxpayer's pocket, which you can get on your tax return, by the way, this coming for 2019, or you can use that money to stimulate green industry, companies that are producing green solutions. And incidentally, I just heard on the radio this morning that I could hardly imagine this, but this is true, that 3D houses are now being made. There have been 2 prototypes printed by 3D methods, 3D computer method. You just have a big printer and it prints out what you want, right? And you can use different materials to do that. You can use molten metals or paper or plastics or any kinds of things. Anyway, they printed out these houses for people who are need low-cost housing, and they can be printed out in a day. You don't need everybody to put it up. It's all made, and there it is. A 3D printed house. Yeah, I was surprised by that. That was on the news this morning. Okay, so science does have a role here as well in trying to help out because, for example, this is an example. Studies have been made of where there are favorable areas for reforestation, for example. If we, what we don't want to really do is cut down trees, but because they store carbon and they sequester, what is called sequestering, they store it into the roots and it goes into the ground where it's supposed to be, and taken out of the air by the leaves through photosynthesis. But there are certain areas which are better suited than others. And so there has been a study which has looked at places where you can reforest. And so this brings us to the kinds of things that groups of people or businesses can do. And there is something called the Billion Tree Campaign. This was inspired by the lady whose photo you see there. She is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate from Kenya, a Kenyan lady. And she said, it's the little things citizens do that will make the difference. My little thing is planting trees. But you notice that the initial target there, her initial target of having planting of 1 billion trees was already achieved in a year. By November 2007, 1 billion trees have been planted around the world. And to date, 13.6 billion trees have been planted across 193 countries. Now, she didn't do this all by herself. There is a big group that is involved in doing this. But over on the left-hand side, you can see the various countries and how many billions or millions of trees have been planted in those places. Now, you notice that Canada is not on that list, but it doesn't mean that trees aren't planted here. It's just that we have lots and lots of them already, and I guess there hasn't been as much effort to plant them here necessarily. And there are other interesting things as well. So this is in Milan. This is an unusual concept for planting trees. It's called a vertical forest. And we have a YouTube video just to show you what that actually looks like. Solar panels on the roof too, yes. Now just imagine though the planning that has to go into this. The soil they have to calculate the soil so as not to have too much weight in the buildings. It has to be the right kind of soil to nurture the trees. They have to have people on the ropes that go down the side of the building in order to prune and keep the trees in good order. So there's a lot of work here, and it may not be that practical way of fighting climate change, but it shows that people are thinking about this issue, and even in places like Milan, where there aren't all that many trees growing already, it's an innovative way to try and tackle the problem. So it means if we have people who are clever and who think about this stuff, there are things that we can do. And getting a little more local now, perhaps some of you have heard about the group of volunteers in our neighboring township of Woolwich. This lady, unfortunately, I cannot properly pronounce her name. I don't know if it's Rini or Rini, or does anybody know? I'm afraid I don't. Inga. Anyway, we'll call her Inga. That's her first name. Anyway, she's part of the volunteer group called Trees for Woolwich, and they have planted 32,000 trees over the past several years there, and their goal is for another 5,000 this year. And down on the bottom you can see some of the trees that they have planted. And they also go into schools. On the bottom right-hand side is a flat of seedlings that they take into schools to promote this issue of planting trees. Trees are a relatively simple way for us to take action, and they make us feel good that we can do something, which is helpful, because if we feel more hopeful, then I think we can cooperate better. Okay, so there are things that we individuals can do. There are a lot of us, of course. And I like this saying by David Suzuki: in a world of more than 7 billion people, each of us is a drop in the bucket. But with enough drops, we can fill the bucket. And that's true. So there are any number of small things, and this is where we're coming to in just a moment. I've got some sheets here that I'll pass around. I don't think I probably have enough for everyone. I think it's about 30 of them here. But anyway, the point is, I'd like to take this opportunity for us all here to have some thoughts about what we can do individually. So just to focus that a little bit, so I'll pass these. Yes, if you could just pass them down. I think if we have one for each two people, that would be fine. Okay, so the primary cause of global warming, as we've already, and I think, is there anybody here who does not think that human activity is responsible for global warming? I'm probably preaching to the converted here this morning. That's always the difficulty, right? Okay, so the primary cause of, anyway, if somebody did believe that, I don't think they put their hand up here this morning, would you? We don't want to discriminate against anybody. I mean, everybody's entitled to their opinion. Okay, so the primary cause of global warming is human activity that releases carbon into the atmosphere. And most significantly, this comes about due to the burning of fossil fuels. This is oil and gas and all the things we dig up to provide our energy. And of course, we also we burn those fuels for transportation, and we also use those fuels to operate our homes and businesses. So surely there are things that we can do in terms of changing how we use energy, changing how we use transportation, and also how we operate, use food, and so on in our homes. Surely there are changes we can make. And if we believe David Suzuki's many drops amalgamating into a bucket, if there are enough of us doing lots of small things, just imagine how that adds up. Now, just before we open it up a little bit, I just want to tell you a little story. Now, as already mentioned, I'm not as old as Bob. He's 100, but you may not believe this, but I'm 81, nearly. Anyhow, when I was a boy, the world population was 2 billion people. My mom used to give me a basket and send me shopping to the nearest grocery store. Just used to walk there, get the groceries, green groceries. Milkman used to come around with a horse and cart. We used to go for, this was the UK, holidays down to the seaside. You just hopped on the train, went down to the beach there, 40 or 50 miles away, and had your holiday. There were no plastics, and food waste and so on were all collected up and used by farmers to feed the pigs. Now today, I can't hardly believe this, population 7.7 billion people. 2 billion when I was a boy, 80 years ago, a child, baby. Let's not get older than I really am, right? Population 7.7 billion today. And guess what I do? I drive to the store. I go down to the food store. I don't walk to the corner store anymore with a little wicker shopping basket, get my mom's groceries. We drive to the store. And I don't go down to the beach anymore, nearby home. I fly all over the world for my holidays. And my deliveries don't come by horse and wagon anymore. They come by all kinds of modes of transportation. They're usually all driven by gasoline. And what's happened to all the plastics that never used to exist when I was a boy? They're all floating in the Pacific Ocean, and they're all over the land. So, we are like human locusts. We consume and we degrade the environment around us. We're dirty people. As people. And because of all of these things that we're doing, we're changing the Earth's environment and the atmosphere in our ever-increasing search for energy and fossil fuels. But there's one difference between us and locusts. We might be like human locusts, but there's a difference between us and locusts. Anybody think what that is? Yes, we are bigger. But we can think, we understand the situation, and hopefully we should know what to do. Locusts don't. They just go out there and they eat and they devastate, and it doesn't matter to them. But we don't have to be human locusts. We don't have to be as dirty as we are and messing up their environment. Goodness me, we're even messing up space now. We send up orbiting things into space, and you've got all kinds of junk, and there's dust up there, and that'll only increase as time goes on. So wherever we go, we pollute it, we mess it up because we don't take proper care of things. So anyway, that's my little sermon. By the way, how old did you say the Earth was, Bob?
How old?
How old?
Oh, well, I don't really know, quite frankly. There's a lot of opinion out there that it's billions of years old. If the stars take 100 million years to send their light to Earth, then maybe they were already created 100 million years ago.
More like 14.7 billion years old. Yes, billions of years. Oh, that's the Earth. That's the Earth, 4.53. Anyway, that's my little sermon for today. And so if you have that sheet, we'd like to take a little bit of time. First of all, do you have any questions? If you have questions, we try and deal with those. And hopefully we can generate a little bit of discussion here as to how we might change these various what will I call them? Categories, I guess, of energy, transportation, and what we do in our homes, the food we eat, and so on. Oh, speaking of that, there is one more slide I want to show you. By the way, I have suggested there visually something we can do in transportation, which is pretty obvious. That is buy an electric car, right? And in terms of energy, there are lots of appliances which have this Energy Star high efficiency tag on them. And you can still even get a rebate on some of those at the moment. The rebate's unfortunately being canceled by another leader we have whose name will be not mentioned this morning. I'm sorry, I'm biased, right? I admit it. I have a very strong bias, so I admit that. Okay, where were we? What were we going to do?
If anyone had a question.
Oh, yes, questions first, that's right.
You were going to show a slide, and then you were going to.
Oh, yes, I'll just show one slide and I will come to you. Okay, so this is important because Sharon has done a lot of work on this, actually, looking into this. And no, we didn't do this slide, but it does show the amount of greenhouse gases emitted per serving of these various food constituents, ranging from beef at the top down there to the bottom being nuts. And the greater the impact, the further over toward the right-hand side of the graph they are. And you can see that the impact of beef is the largest there. There's a range, of course, on the serving. So the range is shown between green and red. And the average, of course, is the circle in the middle. But you can clearly see that the impact of changing our diet would have an impact on the amount of greenhouse gases emitted per serving of food that we have in those various categories. And so we go from beef to nuts in a decreasing fashion there. Okay, so I'm sorry, Jamie, you had a question.
Yeah, well, this raises another question for me because I'm also biased toward agriculture.
Yes.
And I've heard varying opinions on sort of cropping and beef production and that kind of thing. And I guess one of my questions comes from hearing a University of Guelph professor talk about sort of plant decay to produce methane, right? So you can put it through a cow and you will get a certain amount of methane, or you can let the crop die in the field and it will also produce the same amount of methane essentially, right? Because it's a constant in terms of mass of gas produced with the decaying matter and that kind of thing. Now the time frame might be different, but the crop that grows to feed the animal also sequesters a lot of carbon. That's just one point that I've heard debated, and so I'd be happy to hear your point of view on that. And I don't claim to be an expert on any of this, but I am involved in agriculture, a vested interest in agriculture, right, with the work I do. Second question would be around electric vehicles. Again, I've heard lots of debate about the production of batteries and the mining of those metals being very bad for the environment. So again, not really being equated with burning gasoline, but still an issue, right? So I'm just happy to hear your comment because I'm sure that you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, much more than I have.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm an expert either. I'm a meteorologist, but I don't know about everything in the world. So some of these are tough for me to answer. But I think that for every action you take, there's probably something negative that can happen as a result of whatever action we take. And so it's a matter, I think, of looking at the balance of those things. And so in the case of cars, for example, I believe it's the case that there is far more benefit from going to electric vehicles in terms of the CO2 gas emissions than the harms done by mining metals. Yes, that is a real concern. Obviously, we're doing something negative there, but what we're trying to do is preserve the world. And we're not going to be able to mine the metals if the world we live in is untenable, right? We won't have a lot of the things that we want to do if the world is not properly livable, and we're fighting all the consequences that people are fleeing as a result of droughts and squabbling over water and all the various issues that can arise with world populations. So it's a matter, I think, of balance more than anything. And yes, I agree with you, there's always a downside. Now the other, what was the first question? Pardon? Oh yes, the beef, the farming and so on. Yes, again, it's the same story there. But we have, pardon? Yes, I'll come to you. I was just going to finish answering this question, if I may. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Anyway, husband and wife, you know. Anyway, with regard to beef and farm animals, they emit a huge amount of flatulence. We all do, actually, people do as well. We're not saying get rid of people, of course, but maybe we can reduce the amount of cattle, I don't know. But yes, we do get methane from grasses as they decompose, but they do decompose back to carbon. So it's, again, a matter of the balance, really. No, sorry, Sharon, go ahead.
That's okay. I was just going to say, too, a chart like that is talking about a continuum. So you've got people who are beef farmers, small scale, conscious of how they do things, and then you've got beef farmers that are completely destroying Amazon forests to graze beef. So there's a continuum of, you know, from most harm to least harm, and I think that chart is looking at, you know, worldwide. It's not Canadian farmers, it's beef farmers worldwide, and not everybody practices well.
Yes, that's a good point. We do have to remember we're talking worldwide, and practices change everywhere. So there is, in all of this, I will point out, there is no one answer that fits all. There are some things that we can do as individuals that other people, it just wouldn't suit them to do those things. So what we can come up with today, or talk about or think about today, isn't necessarily the answer. It's part of an answer, and it's what part of the answer we as individuals can deal with. But I think we can all contribute to the part of the answer. Bob?
Are there any statistics that would give us some sense of the benefit of a tree to what we use? So in other words, the tree uses up the CO2, right?
Mm-hmm. Converts it, yeah.
So how much does a tree use up versus what we produce by driving a car? Is any of that available? And
I think so, but that would require more research than I've done to find the answer to that. But yes, those things are known. People do look into that matter because it's vitally important, and that information is available. But it means you have to search. And sometimes, this is the problem with scientists, we found some, just as quickly as that. How planting trees can reduce your carbon footprint. But scientists are not very good at educating people in a meaningful way. You know, the language and so on is all very obtuse, and it's not so easy for us to read scientific journals. But we can always go to Google, and we can have our handy video guy at the back here come up with the answers for us very quickly. Yeah, so planting trees, you can help clean the air and fight climate change. I think that's, you know, we're only looking at the bottom line here, basically, as to what are the best ways to do things. Okay. All right, so, yes.
So I just have one more question. I understand that you're not, shall we say, a fan of said provincial leadership, and I would agree with that statement. But the question that I have is, for those of us who agree with that, for those of us who agree with that kind of statement, how can we advocate for something that we just totally see as a no-brainer with this government and make our voice heard in a way that they don't, so that they don't get their backs up, that they're not defensive?
I'm glad you asked that question. You set me up with that one. The simple answer is vote. Where we put our votes. Now, I like to be honest. I'll tell you that I have been a Liberal voter all my life. The past election, I voted Green. And I think we have, if we're concerned about, really concerned about climate change, I mean, truly concerned about it, we have to vote for the party, whichever that is. Now, I happen to vote Green, but whatever the party is that has a science-based, real platform to fight climate change. And in my case, the decision I made was that the Green Party had that platform, because I see climate change as a slow-motion catastrophe. I've said this before to some of you, and I'll say it again, because climate change is a slow-motion catastrophe. We wake up today and we don't see a great deal of change from yesterday. We wake up this year, we don't see a whole lot of change from last year. We wake up 80 years later, like me, and we see a big change from that time. So it's happening in slow motion, and so it's very easy for us to pass it off and say, oh, nothing much is happening. So what? I don't have to go out and spend money. Why do I have to spend money to buy? It's expensive to go buy an electric car. I'd much rather drive a great big truck, you know, one person in it, and leave it idling while the kids are in school, and I go and pick them up and leave all my lights on at home. Terry.
I kind of have two comments. First, I agree 100% with you about voting. So as a person that has to enforce provincial regulation with building, some dumb things have been done with regulation. One of them is a year and a half ago, it was mandatory for all new houses built in Ontario to have electric vehicle charging stations.
Yeah.
Put in the garages for the future. The current government came along and squashed that. So back in the summer, we were told, oh, you don't have to do that anymore. So I think that was one thing that was really done. Another thing is the past provincial government set in motion energy efficiency standards for all buildings, houses, commercial buildings. Commercial buildings was awesome because there never really was a standard. We're being told with the code changes that are coming that some of those things may be rolled back, and of course Ontario wants to be open for business, and construction industry is 3.8 billion or something in Ontario, and too much red tape, too much regulation. So the current government would like to roll back some regulation. So I agree, vote. That's a big one. Another thing with the chart, I wholeheartedly understand and get what you're saying. As a drop in the bucket kind of thing for an individual person, does it help to buy local?
Yes.
That's what I've been trying to learn as well, that if you buy the beef local, you buy your pork local, you buy your vegetables and things local that don't come on a truck from California,
Yeah.
that helps a lot too. So
Yes.
thanks for your presentation. This is awesome.
Okay. All right. And by the way, you can always go get a beer for $1, you know.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I'm really showing my bias this morning, aren't I?
that's okay. I just
Sharon.
wanted to say, you know, you alluded to what life was like when you were a young boy, like 2,000 years ago. In some of the research that I've been doing with you on the impact of food, household, and clothing, if we do go back to the way my mother, who went through the Depression, did things, saved string off the bags from the potatoes, and, you know, she got pretty extreme sometimes, but in general, if we do roll ourselves back to that time period in the 1940s, 50s, where, especially in the 40s during the war years, where they were very, very frugal, and you know, you bought what you needed when you went shopping, you bought what you needed for that week, you knew what you were going to cook. You know, those kinds of things. There's a site called 1 Million Women out of Australia, and they have this really neat thing you can go through. It asks you questions about your life, and it shows you how much carbon you save doing certain things. So it's a really interesting process to go through, and you realize that if we go back to the way we reused everything, consumed as little as possible, that makes a big impact per person in the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. And you might multiply that by 7.7 billion, that'd be a heck of a lot of carbon that we're not putting in.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
I have a perspective that maybe isn't accurate, and maybe you can shed some light on it. Tree planting is something I favor. I like the idea of it. I see many people that have taken land that they own and they have planted trees. And all within my short lifetime, I'm so much younger than Bob. And I see that the trees are now dead and they're just, that land is sitting there. To me, my point of view is that the type of tree you plant is important. I don't support the planting of coniferous trees because my short perspective is they only last a short time. I would rather see a deciduous tree that gets planted and will live to be 100, 150 years old or whatever. Do you have any sense of, is my vision or my perspective wrong, or am I right?
No, you're perfectly correct. And in fact, the Woolwich Endeavour, that's exactly what they do. They plant a variety of trees. If you have monocropping, that's probably the worst way in which you could plant a tree. And the University of Guelph has put out quite a bit of information about how to plant trees, what mixture of trees might suit our coming climate, because we are seeing the climate change here. And so certain trees will do better than they used to here, for example. So yes, there's quite a bit of research done on that, and you're perfectly correct. Jen?
We purchased trees from Grand River when we built our place, and if you go to Grand River Conservation Authority's website, they will recommend trees that you should plant for your area and type of soil you have, and it was very, very helpful in deciding on what trees to plant. And again, like Michael said, they stress a variety, not just all one kind. So if you're looking for advice about tree planting, GRCA is really good.
Thank you.
So I'm not an expert on trees, but I have to tell you my husband is. We affectionately know him in our family as the tree guy. And every chance we go hiking, which is every day, he talks about buds and leaves and striations on bark and all that kind of stuff. So I can't tell you how many times he's talked about why would the town impose these kind of maples and monocropping, blah, blah, blah. So if you have any desire to plant something also on your lawn or on your property, the GRCA is good. And if you want any hands-on help, please call Paul. He would love to help you.
I'd like to go back to what Terry said. There's all kinds of technology out there that would be much more efficient than most of what we put in our houses. So what would it take for a township or a county or whatever to say, you know what, if you're going to build new houses in our area, this is what you have to put in?
So actually, I was part of a committee, and I'm still part of the committee in the Regional Waterloo Chief Building Officials to talk about green building standards and what municipalities can do to help developers green build better. So one of the things we can do, the best thing for developers is save the money. They love saving money, right? The more they build, the more money they save. So some of the things that the cities are doing, they're forcing them, or they're giving them a break on development charges if they implement some of those strategies in their building. Electric vehicle charging stations in the parking garages, bicycle parking areas, what were some other things? Again, increase efficiency of the build. So if they build to a higher standard of Energy Star or EnerGuide, there's a few different standards that they can, Energy Star is the big one. So they get breaks on development charges depending on how they build and build smarter and use better materials. The construction industry in Ontario is a terrible waste of resources. If you drive through any subdivision, the amount of wood we waste is unbelievable. So municipalities are trying to do things, but it's baby steps, and to get the mindset changed of the builder-developer is really, really hard. The only thing you can do is save them money. That's the only incentive they see. Mm-hmm. So anything you can do to save the money, and it comes down to intensification, a lot of it too. So the trade-off for less development charges is letting them build more, closer together, higher. So it becomes a real trade-off fight of what happens. A lot of the things have to come provincially in regulation, so the building code, energy efficiency standards, that again has to come from the top. I can't supersede the building code and say if you build to this standard, you can build more, kind of a thing. It's all provincial regulation. I mean, there's incentives we can do for permit fees and things like that, but the regulation itself is provincial. So a lot of it, again, is how you vote and who's in charge. But yeah, building in Ontario is a terrible waste of resource. It really, really is. We're terrible the way we build. And I don't know, I haven't seen a whole lot of change in my 22 or 3 year career. We still do the same things we did back in the early 90s, and we still waste a lot. So that's, we've talked about it at length at different committees, and it comes down to two is, it's, everything in Ontario is cheap. Energy's cheap, lumber's cheap, concrete's cheap, so that's why it's done. It's a terrible waste of resources and emits a lot of greenhouse gas in the process, but it's the way it is in Ontario because everything's cheap. If you're paying $6 or $7 a liter for diesel fuel, you're going to change the way you do stuff like they do in Europe. So anyway, that's just my kind of sermon too.
Yeah, that's, I've always noticed that we build cardboard houses, Robbie.
Is it the same, Terry, as well for Wilma Township, as since you work there?
Yeah.
Is it the same thing?
Yeah, it is, Rob. Yeah.
Okay, well, I hear the clinking of dishes and what have you over here, and we're approaching the witching hour of 12 o'clock. So unless there are any further questions, I'll turn it back to you, Bob.
Are there more questions? A few more if you have anything. One of the things we did when we built 50 Kent, the MCC building in Kitchener, was we had talked about, I'm trying to get the certified building name, I can't remember it. Yes. And what we decided to do was we were told it would be about $100,000 to go for that certification. And what we ended up choosing to do was not spend it, but use the $100,000 to put more energy efficient stuff in the building. So we have a building that for the most part meets the criteria, but is not certified because we didn't go through all the paperwork, all the stuff to do, but we put that money back into the building and created a very efficient building in a whole variety of ways. And if you drive by that building now, you also realize that the whole roof is full of solar panels. And what we did when we built is we extended the beam structure up through the roof and prepared for it so that when we were able to get the approval to put the solar panel on the roof, we didn't have to open the roof to put the structure up so they could do it. So all that stuff was prepared for. The switchgear was in place. A whole bunch of things were in place to put those solar panels up. So there are ways, if people are willing, there are things that you can do and ways that you can do things. And in my sense would be is that as people who understand or want to feel responsible for some of the things that we've talked about, then we should be people who are willing to spend the extra dollars to go that extra mile, I think, and do some of those kinds of things, because that's what it's going to take. People who are willing to do just a little bit more to make this happen, and I think that's important. One of the things Richard Rohr also says is that it's very difficult to harm something or someone you love. And if we go back to the concept of we love God's creation, we love the people on it, we love the resources that we have, we love the environment, the fields of birds and flowers and all those kinds of things, then we'll have a harder time harming it. And so we need to return back to loving this earth and loving each other, and then move forward and do what we can to put one drop in the bucket. I mean, that's all we have to do. We need to put one drop in the bucket. We don't have to fill the bucket ourselves. And there's simple things that we can do. Pardon?
What is that building?
There you go. That's 50 Kent. Yes. So you can see how full that is, a resource for that. Very good. Well, thank you very much for your attention, for your interest in this topic. There's many, many more sites that are slides that Michael could have produced, but we are limited by time, so we thank you. There's a potluck after. There's all kinds of food here, so please stay. Even if you didn't bring something, I'm sure that there's extra here for somebody who forgot to bring something. But stay for the potluck and let's enjoy it and go from there. Thank you very much.